And welcome back to this edition of Sports Talk. Great to be with you on this Monday night. Doug Miles and Don Henderson with you as we just had a great weekend of sports, particularly in college football and pro football. But we're going to talk a little Philadelphia sports right now with a man who's been covering Philadelphia sports for a long time, great sports writer. And I'll let Don do the introduction because Don and Rick Westcott go back a ways. Don, I'll let you take it.
Well, Rich Westcott has been a long time in Philadelphia, as you indicated, Doug. We've been in the Philadelphia Sportswriter together for a great number of years. And just to preface our conversation tonight, Rich and I did a show last week one day, and I let him explain why it all came about. But I opened up the paper here in Sarasota, Florida, and I opened the sports section, and here's Rich Westcott has got a story on the front page of the Herald Tribune about a player that played at Sarasota, lived at played at Venice, but lived in Sarasota. And I said, "What the heck is this? A guy from Philadelphia is writing a story in the paper here." So, Rich, let's bring you in because you've been a long-time sports writer. We got a lot of things to talk about tonight, but let's start off with what got the conversation going last week in the front page of the Herald Sports section.
Well, the story's about Dalton Guthrie, who is a Sarasota native, and he was with the Phillies. So he called him up from the minor leagues in early September, and he was on the roster throughout the end of the season. He wasn't on the roster for the World Series, but he did nevertheless suit up and sit in the dugout. And so since he was from Sarasota, and the ironic thing is the reason I got talking about him in the first place is that my daughter lives in Sarasota, and her daughter, my granddaughter, is married to a guy who knew Guthrie and his brother. So we got talking about him, and I learned that his father was also there. He'd pitched in the big leagues for 15 years. And so I got talking to Dalton when he was at the ballpark one night, and it just seemed to be a pretty good story. So we went from there. And lo and behold, the Sarasota paper played it up very nicely.
Well, not only that, but he came up, as you indicated, at the end of the season, month of September, but he was there. And the big thing was he got a couple of hits at RBI. He didn't just come in and not produce.
No, that's true. He did. And he got a home run while he was here. He didn't have that many trips to the plate, but, he indicated that he was a pretty good player, and I think the Phillies are going to be able to use him well in the future.
Let's talk a little bit about the relationship between he and his dad, because that was very strong, and that was a big part of your column here in the Sarasota paper, that how they worked together.
Well, as I said, his dad pitched 15 years in the big leagues, and Dalton told me that his dad took him under his wing and started to teach him the rudiments of the game when he was a kid, and that he really paid a lot of attention to what his dad was saying and learned the game from him. And he thanked his dad for putting him where he is today. And it was a lot of nice things he had to say about his dad and how much he learned from his dad as a baseball player, and it was kind of a nice combination. And as he said, I was really lucky to have a dad who played big league baseball. Not many kids have that. So, it worked out well from that standpoint for him, and he paid tribute to his dad very nicely.
Well, before I bring Doug back in again, you've written 27 books, but you've written 6 books primarily about the Philadelphia history of the Philadelphia Phillies and the story of Philadelphia Philly baseball. But at the same time, a very exciting time in Philadelphia this year, because nobody expected at the beginning of the season. Certainly nobody expected in the middle of the season. And by the time it came to going to the playoffs, everybody had written the Phillies off going to St. Louis. But that wasn't what happened.
Well, nobody, I don't think anywhere, expected them to go into the playoffs in the first place. And they didn't have a real great September as it was. But, they won just enough to qualify, and, then they went from one playoff to the next and got to the World Series. And there again, who would have ever thought that they were going to go to the World Series this year. That was just not part of the picture. But lo and behold, there they were. And okay, so they didn't win it, but they sure put up a good fight. And only drawback really was a no-hitter, which I question whether or not you can call it a no-hitter, really. Okay, they didn't get any hits, but, when you have that many guys going into the game and pitching, it's a little less than a no-hitter is really. And I happen to write a book on no-hitters, and we wrote about, I did this book a long time ago with Alan Lewis. I'm sure, Don, you remember him. With the Enquirer many years, and we wrote a book on each no-hitter pitched up until year 2000, and all the no-hitters we always talked about were the ones that pitcher pitched a complete game. So this was a little different, and we've talked about this since the game itself. We wondered, the way pitching staffs are handled these days is totally different, but you would have thought at least the manager would have let him stay in a little bit longer to see if he could, pitch in a couple more innings of a no-hitter. But, that's the way it is these days.
Doug, I'll bring you in now. We'll talk a little bit more about what you would, as you observed the season so far.
I was going to say, you talk about the no-hitter by committee. It wasn't exactly Don Larson, was it, from 1956? But I think we're like you mentioned, Rick, we're not going to see the complete game no-hitters anymore because these managers are so sticking to the analytics. No matter how good he's doing, the pitcher, if he hits that pitch number, they're going to pull him out. So it's a rarity. Probably going to see hardly any no-hitters anymore.
Well, the word no-hitter, as well as the word shutout and complete game, they're words of the past. And here I just read, I forget who it was, but the guy who led the league in, I guess it was the American League in complete games, had 6 complete games, which was more than the whole rest of the league. I think it was the American League. I'm not sure which, but that's the route that complete games have gone these days. And I did a book on amazing Phillies Feats, which was my last book actually. And one of the things I wrote about was Robin Roberts completed 28 complete games in a row. That's absolutely astounding in today's game, But things are changing, that's for sure.
And that brings us back to we talked about it before as well. And Wheeler, who was Philly's best pitcher primarily, he hadn't had a great deal of success the last couple of games. But there were only runners on first and third, and one out. I think it was one out. One out or no out. You'll know better than I can't remember. And all of a sudden, they come out and they take him out of the game. And he only gave up, 2 hits before that? And that was a little astounding to you.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, that's happened all season. And I remember it happened to Nola one game. He was pitching a 3-hit shutout in the 7th inning, and he gives up a hit, and boom, they took him out. And look at the thing with Alvarado. They take out Wheeler because the left-handed batter is coming up, and they bring in Alvarado, and boom, he gives up a 3-run homer, and that's the end of the series. He pulled a Mitch Williams on him.
Talking about your book, Rick, on the Phillies Feats, I guess you could almost make an analogy. I think the Phillies may have had a little more success, maybe, but kind of with the New York Mets, some great years, classic years, but heartbreaking losses along the way, and then some tremendous years where we saw them win the World Series down here against Tampa about 12, 13 years ago, and then of course this year the unexpected, like the 1973 Mets in a sense, getting to the playoffs, getting to the World Series. So I know Don, just from you and I talking about it, covering that team, a lot of ups and downs. The ups have been great, but there have also been some tough years as well.
Oh, absolutely. Well, it's you look back at the Phillies' record. They're playing 140 years, and they've been to exactly 8 World Series, which isn't a big number compared with some of the teams. Like, what are the Yankees been to 27 World Series, something like that?
Right.
So but you take what you get, and I know the city has been really happy with this team this year, the way things turned out. Even if they did lose the series, they got there. And boy, the crowd.
One story, and I'm really throwing this right out of left field because the fact you brought up right in the book with Alan Lewis about the no-hitters. I wonder if he included in that no-hitter production the one at Ebbets Field in Brooklyn that was pitched against the Philadelphia Phillies, and it was a no-hitter, and the reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer didn't make the game. He made his story up, put it in the paper the next day, but he forgot one thing. He forgot to mention it was a no-hit game. Did they talk about that one?
I'm trying to think of who that was. I don't remember.
I can't tell you the writer because it was like it had to be like in the early 40s, I guess, or in that 40 area. I heard the story many times, but I never heard who the writer was that didn't make the game and made up the story.
Well, I remember
Bill Conlon would do that every once in a while. He'd go on a road trip with the Eagles, and he'd have what he called from the bulletin. He'd get his notes on the way back on a plane. He'd write the greatest story in the world, but he wasn't at the game.
Well, there's a lot of stories like this. I remember, and one of your people down in Florida for many years, Danny Litweiler. Danny was an outfielder for 11 years in the big leagues and was a player with the Phillies. And in 1942, he became the first player in Major League history, first outfielder, to play a whole season without an error. And he didn't realize that. There was a game they were playing against the Giants, and there was rain all over. It had rained, and the field was real slippery. And Johnny Mize hit a ball to left field where Danny was playing, and Danny came running after it, and he slipped and fell in the field. It was so wet, and the ball hit off his hand and went, and Mize got on base. Well, they gave Litweiler an error for that, and he never knew. And a couple days later, he was looking at the box score, and there was no error in the box score. So he says, "What the heck happened here?" And Danny was a good friend of mine. He lived in Clearwater for many years after he retired, and of course, along the way, he was the head baseball coach at Florida State and so forth. But anyway, so he says, "What the heck happened?" And he asked one of the reporters, and he says, he said, "Didn't you hear the story?" And he said, "No, what happened?" He says, "I was given an error on that play." He said, "No," he said, "after the game," he says, "Johnny Mize came storming up to the press box in his uniform. He didn't even take it off yet. And he went to the scorekeeper, who I forget who it was, and he said, 'What the heck are you doing giving him an error?' He says, 'I was a hit for me, and I'm trying to bat 300, and you took away a hit from me.' And he's yelling and screaming at him, and the guy changed it and made it into a hit. And Danny never knew that until he saw the box score. So it's just one of these things, you never know.
I was going to say, I've heard stories.
Till it's over.
I've heard stories like that of us covering the A-League, Florida A-League teams down here, and a buddy of mine, Rich, you know him, Spitz, Don. He was the official scorer a few times, and a lot of players, if it was a questionable call, they'd come right up, or the manager usually would call them right after the game and say change it. So not unusual to have that happen if you're a scorer.
Oh yeah, well I was the scorer at Phillies games for a while, some years ago. I was one of the scorers, and I remember a couple times players would call up from the dugout
right
after you made a call, or try to argue argue the call to change it, and that happened a couple times, and sometimes they'd call up to the PR people and get them to go argue for them. So, in fact, you talk about scorekeeping. That was one tough job. I'll tell you.
Rich Westcott, our special guest this segment of the program. We're chatting about, well, a number of things. One, of course, the young man that played baseball for the Philadelphia Phillies this year in the month of September came up, that lives here in Sarasota, but went to school in Venice, played for Venice High School, but then, of course, was drafted. Maybe before we leave that story, just quickly, chat a little bit about where he was drafted and what happened between then and when he got to the Phillies.
Well, he was drafted originally by the Minnesota Twins, and at that time he was in college at Florida University, and he turned it down and continued to play in college. Well, a few years later, the Phillies drafted him, and by this time he was basically done college, so he took the draft and went into their minor league system, and this was 2017 when this happened. So he was in the minors until they called him up this past September, and he worked his way up. He started low Class A and worked his way up. He played in Clearwater and Reading, and finally Lehigh Valley, which is in Allentown, and that's where he was playing AAA ball when the Phillies called him up in September. So he's had a good career.
Go ahead, Doug.
I was going to say, I've had a chance over the years to call a lot of the high school sports and a lot of baseball down here. Sarasota High is another great program. Clyde Metcalf for many years sent many players to the major leagues. And now Venice, the last, I'd say, 10 or 15 years, has kind of got up to that level as well. So a lot of people don't realize the great hotbed not only of football talent in Florida, but baseball talent, particularly in this part of Florida, in Sarasota, Bradenton, and Venice.
Well, Dalton told me that the reason he went to Venice, even though he was a resident of Sarasota, that his father sent him there because they had a better baseball program.
Yeah.
And it was such a good one that his father wanted him to go there instead of stay in Sarasota, which is what he did.
Rich Westcott, our guest, and in summation, let's chat a little bit. I said, my number may be incorrect, 27 books, but touch on a couple that you'd like to mention and how people get a chance to read, if they're a Philly historian or whether some of the other things that you've written about over the years, maybe they'd like to check in and take a look at some of your books.
Well, I mentioned the last one I wrote was about the amazing Phillies Feats, and the one before that I wrote a book on a guy named Biz Mackey, who was Hall of Fame Negro League catcher, the greatest all-around catcher in Negro League history. And I'd also done a book on Eddie Gottlieb, who was a really fascinating book, given all the things he's done over the years, or did over the years.
What a character.
The amazing thing today, and I tried to write something about this for the Inquirer, and they wouldn't take it, is that Gottlieb was born in Kiev, Ukraine, and his father and mother had to leave because they were persecuted by the Russians back then, and so he left. They left when he was 4 years old, and that was in 1898 when he came to this country. But anyway, that was another one. One of my favorite books. I wrote a book about Philadelphia pro teams that have won championships. In all the pro sports, and going back to the original days with the Athletics, who won 4 or 5 World Series, and then I went up. Actually, the book came out before the Eagles won the Super Bowl, but I went up through all those other teams: the Flyers, Sixers, Phillies, Warriors, and so forth. And that was a real fun book to do because I got to talk to a lot of the more recent guys, and that's been carrying along. The book I did on Mickey Vernon, who he's a Delaware County guy here, and 2-time American League batting champion, and just an absolutely great person. And it was a real fun book to do with him. So it's been good. It did 7 or 8 Phillies books, and did one called the Phillies Encyclopedia, which covers every fraction of Phillies history. and that's a big book. We have 3 editions. I did that with Frank Pulaski, who used to work for the Bulletin years ago. But yeah, it's been fun. A lot of big, good fun out there. Talks with a lot of interesting people.
Well, Doug, I'll let you close things out. First of all, thank you very, very much for joining us again. I hope we can have you on not only this show, but the other show every once in a while, just to touch on some of the things that are happening in the world of sports that you've touched on.
Well, that'd be good. I'd love to do it.